The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Thomas Mitchell adjusted his uniform one final time. The bronze medal pinned to his chest caught the light, its inscription barely visible after years of careful polishing. He had worn this medal every day for 15 years, through ceremonies, parades, and countless hours standing guard at the palace gates. Today, however, would be different. Thomas had served as a royal guard for most of his adult life. At 43, his shoulders still held the rigid posture of military training, and his eyes maintained the alert watchfulness that had made him one of the most trusted members of the royal security detail. The medal he wore represented the highest honor a guard could receive, the Medal of Valor, awarded to him personally by the Queen after an incident that had changed his life forever. The trouble had started 3 weeks ago with a simple traffic violation. Thomas had been driving home after a long shift when he accidentally ran a red light at an intersection near his apartment. The police officer who pulled him over was young and eager, the type who followed regulations to the letter. When Thomas showed his identification, explaining that he was returning from duty at the palace, the officer's expression had hardened rather than softened. "I don't care where you work," the officer had said, his voice sharp with authority. "You broke the law, and you'll face the consequences like everyone else." Thomas had accepted the ticket without argument. He understood the officer's position and respected the principle that no one should be above the law. What he hadn't expected was for this minor incident to spiral into something much larger and more painful than he could have imagined. The officer, whose name was David Parker, had noticed the medal during their interaction. Something about Thomas's calm demeanor and the prestigious decoration had bothered him. Parker spent the following days researching the Medal of Valor and the circumstances under which it had been awarded to Thomas. What he discovered led him to file a formal complaint with the court, claiming that Thomas had obtained the medal through fraudulent means. According to Parker's research, the official records of the incident that had earned Thomas his medal were incomplete. There were gaps in the timeline, missing witness statements, and what Parker called convenient omissions in the official report. He argued that Thomas had fabricated or exaggerated his heroic actions to receive recognition he didn't deserve. The accusation hit Thomas the weeks following the court case brought unexpected changes to Thomas's life. The story of the hearing had spread through the media, though many of the most sensitive details remained classified. What the public learned was that a decorated royal guard had been falsely accused of fraud and had been vindicated when the full truth came to light. The attention was uncomfortable for Thomas, who had spent his entire career avoiding the spotlight. Reporters called his home, photographers waited outside the palace gates, and well-meaning supporters sent letters of congratulations and support. For someone whose job required discretion and anonymity, the sudden fame was overwhelming. But the most significant change came from an unexpected source. Princess Catherine, now 23 years old and a prominent member of the royal family, had learned about the court case and requested a private meeting with Thomas. When palace officials approached him about the meeting, Thomas was initially reluctant. He had never sought recognition for his actions, and the thought of discussing that day with the person whose life he had helped save felt too personal and emotional. The meeting was arranged for a quiet afternoon in a private sitting room at the palace. Princess Catherine arrived exactly on time, her demeanor professional but warm. Thomas had seen her countless times during his years of service, but always from a distance and always in his role as a security officer. Speaking with her as equals felt strange and surreal. "Mr. Mitchell," she began, settling into a chair across from him, "I wanted to thank you personally for what you did 15 years ago. I know it's been difficult for you to keep the details private all these years." Thomas felt a familiar discomfort with being thanked for simply doing his job. "Your Highness, I was just following my training. Any guard would have done the same thing." "That's not true, and we both know it," she replied gently. "I've read the classified reports. I know exactly what you prevented that day, and I know it wasn't just luck or training. It was courage and quick thinking that saved not just my life, but potentially the lives of many others." She paused, looking thoughtful. "I also know that carrying that secret has been a burden for you. The court case made that clear. I wanted you to know that I understand what you've sacrificed to protect my family's privacy and security." The conversation that followed was unlike anything Thomas had expected. Princess Catherine spoke about growing up knowing that people had risked their lives to keep her safe, but not knowing the specific details. She described the weight of learning, as an adult, about threats she had never known existed as a child. I learned about what happened 3 years ago, when I was given full security briefings as part of my increased royal duties, she said. Reading that report, knowing how close it came, it changed how I think about my role and my responsibilities. Thomas listened, struck by her maturity and thoughtfulness. The 8-year-old girl he had helped protect had grown into a woman who understood the complexities of public service and personal sacrifice. Your Highness, he said carefully, may I ask you something? Of course. Do you ever resent the security, the constant protection? Does it feel like a burden? She considered the question seriously. Sometimes, she admitted. But then, I think about people like you, who put their own safety at risk to protect others. If you can carry that responsibility, then I can carry mine. The meeting lasted for over an hour, covering topics Thomas had never expected to discuss with a member of the royal family. They talked about duty, sacrifice, and the weight of serving something larger than oneself. By the end, Thomas felt a profound sense of closure that he hadn't realized he needed. Meanwhile, Officer David Parker was dealing with the aftermath of the case in his own way. The media attention had painted him as an overzealous officer who had persecuted a hero, a characterization that was both unfair and deeply painful. Parker had acted from genuine conviction, believing he was exposing corruption and demanding accountability. His police department had been supportive, recognizing that his intentions had been good even if his conclusions had been wrong. But Parker struggled with the public perception and with his own doubts about his judgment. He had always prided himself on his ability to see through deception and identify wrongdoing. Being so completely wrong about Thomas had shaken his confidence in his own abilities. 3 weeks after the case ended, Parker made an unexpected decision. He contacted Thomas directly and asked if they could meet for coffee. Thomas, who had been thinking about the young officer and his obvious dedication to justice, readily agreed. They met at a small cafe near Parker's precinct, away from the media attention that still occasionally flared around both of them. Parker looked tired and seemed to have aged years in the few weeks since the trial. I've been thinking about what you said, Parker began without preamble. About me just doing my job. The thing is, I'm not sure I was doing my job well. Thomas stirred his coffee thoughtfully. What do you mean? A good police officer investigates thoroughly before making accusations. I had pieces of information, but I didn't have the whole picture. I let my assumptions fill in the gaps instead of digging deeper to find the truth. You had legitimate concerns based on what you could see, Thomas replied. The security classifications made it impossible for you to get the full picture. That's not your fault. But I could have been more careful, Parker insisted. I could have approached it differently, asked more questions before jumping to conclusions. They talked for nearly 2 hours, discussing the case, their respective careers, and the challenges of serving the public in different capacities. Thomas found himself genuinely liking the young officer, appreciating his dedication and his willingness to admit his mistakes. Can I ask you something? Parker said as their conversation wound down. How do you live with the weight of what you know? All those secrets, all that responsibility. Thomas smiled slightly. You find purpose in it. Every day I go to work knowing that what I do matters, that I'm protecting people who can't protect themselves. That makes the burden worth carrying. The conversation marked the beginning of an unlikely friendship. Parker began to see Thomas as a mentor, someone who could help him understand the complexities of justice and service. Thomas, for his part, appreciated Parker's idealism and determination, recognizing in the younger man the same dedication to justice that had driven his own career. The media attention gradually faded, but the impact of the case continued to resonate in unexpected ways. The palace made subtle changes to its security protocols, incorporating lessons learned from both Thomas's heroic actions and the subsequent legal challenges. The balance between transparency and security remained delicate, but the case had highlighted the importance of both accountability and protection. Thomas returned to his normal duties with a renewed sense of purpose. The medal felt different now, not heavier or lighter, but somehow more meaningful. It had been tested and validated, its worth proven not just in the original moment of heroism, but in the crucible of legal scrutiny and public examination. 6 months after the case ended, Thomas received an unexpected honor. He was promoted to Chief of Palace Security, a position that would allow him to use his experience and wisdom to train the next generation of royal guards. The promotion came with a ceremony attended by the royal family, including Princess Catherine, who personally congratulated him on his new role. "I can't think of anyone better qualified to protect this family," she told him during the ceremony. "You've already proven your dedication beyond any doubt." Officer Parker was also in attendance, having been invited by Thomas as a guest. The young officer had been promoted to detective and was working on a special task force investigating domestic terrorism. The skills he had developed during his investigation of Thomas, attention to detail, thorough research, and relentless pursuit of truth, had served him well in his new role. After the ceremony, as Thomas stood in his new office overlooking the palace grounds, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. From a traffic ticket to a court case to a promotion, the path had been unexpected and often difficult. But it had also been illuminating, forcing him to examine his own motivations and values. The medal still hung on his uniform, but it no longer felt like a burden or a secret. It was simply a reminder of a moment when training, courage, and dedication had come together to prevent tragedy. More importantly, it represented his ongoing commitment to protection and service, a commitment that had been tested and proven strong. Thomas picked up a file containing profiles of new guard candidates and began to read. His first major task in his new position would be selecting and training the next group of royal guards. As he reviewed their qualifications and backgrounds, he thought about the qualities that really mattered in this job. Not just physical skills or impressive credentials, but integrity, courage, and the ability to make split-second decisions under pressure. The office was quiet except for the distant sounds of the palace. Footsteps in corridors, muffled conversations, the everyday business of an institution that had endured for centuries. Thomas felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that he would continue to play a role in protecting that continuity. Later that evening, as Thomas walked home through the London streets, he passed the intersection where Officer Parker had first pulled him over for running the red light. He stopped for a moment, remembering how that simple traffic violation had set in motion a chain of events that had changed his life in unexpected ways. His phone buzzed with a text message from Parker. "Saw the news about your promotion. Well deserved. Coffee next week to celebrate." Thomas smiled and typed back, "Absolutely. My treat this time." As he continued walking, Thomas reflected on the lessons of the past months. Truth, he had learned, was more complex than simple facts and evidence. Real truth included context, motivation, and the sometimes contradictory demands of justice and security. The medal on his chest represented not just a moment of heroism, but a lifetime of service that would continue to evolve and grow. The city lights reflected off the bronze surface of his medal as Thomas made his way home, ready for whatever challenges his new position might bring. He had proven himself worthy of the honor he wore, and, more importantly, he had learned that sometimes the greatest victories come not from avoiding challenges, but from facing them with courage and integrity. Like the second day of hearings began with an unexpected development. Thomas's lawyer, Robert Chun, requested permission to present additional evidence that had only recently come to light. Judge Foster, though initially reluctant, agreed to hear what Chun had to say. "Your Honor," Chun began, "my client has decided to waive certain security protections to provide this court with a more complete picture of the events in question. We have obtained permission from the appropriate authorities to share previously classified information that directly relates to this case." Officer Parker shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had based his entire argument on the assumption that the missing information supported his theory of fraud. The possibility that there were legitimate reasons for the gaps in the record had not featured prominently in his preparations. Thomas took the witness stand with a calmness that surprised even himself. The past 24 hours had brought him a kind of peace he hadn't expected. Win or lose, he was finally going to tell the complete truth about that day, something he had never been allowed to do before. "Mr. Mitchell," his lawyer began, please tell the court exactly what happened on the morning of March 15th, 15 years ago." Thomas took a deep breath and began his story. He described his assignment to the East Wing, his observation of the suspicious man, and the moment he realized the gravity of the situation. But then, he revealed details that had never appeared in any public record. "The man I stopped wasn't just carrying a detonator," Thomas said quietly. "He was carrying a photograph. When I subdued him, the picture fell from his pocket. It was a photo of Princess Catherine, who was 8 years old at the time. She was scheduled to visit that section of the palace later that morning as part of a school tour." A murmur went through the courtroom. Princess Catherine was now a beloved adult member of the royal family. But 15 years ago, she had been a child whose safety was of paramount importance to the entire nation. Thomas continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion he had kept buried for years. The investigation later revealed that the bombing was planned to coincide with the princess's visit. The terrorists had studied her schedule and knew exactly where she would be and when. "If I hadn't stopped that man, if the device had been planted successfully," he didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the courtroom understood the implications. This hadn't been just an attack on a building or even on the royal family in general. It had been a targeted assassination attempt against a child. Why wasn't this information included in the original reports? Judge Foster asked, her professional demeanor unable to completely hide her shock at the revelation. Chun stood to answer. "Your Honor, the security services made the decision to classify these details to protect the princess and to avoid giving other potential attackers information about palace security procedures. The official reports contained only the minimum information necessary to document the incident." Officer Parker was visibly struggling with this new information. His entire case had been built on the assumption that the missing details supported his theory of fraud. Learning that those details actually made Thomas's actions more heroic, not less, was clearly not what he had expected. But Parker wasn't ready to concede defeat. During cross-examination, he pressed Thomas on specific details, looking for inconsistencies that might still support his fraud theory. "Mr. Mitchell," Parker said, consulting his notes, "you claim you immediately recognized the device as a detonator. But, according to your original statement, you described it only as a small electronic device. Isn't it convenient that your memory has become more specific over time?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "Officer Parker, I've thought about that day every single day for 15 years. The details haven't become more specific. I've simply never been allowed to share them before. I knew immediately what I was looking at because of my military training before joining the Royal Guard. I had seen similar devices during my service in Afghanistan." This revelation prompted Chun to introduce additional evidence. Thomas's military records, which showed extensive experience with explosive devices during his deployment overseas. Far from being an ordinary guard who had stumbled into heroism, Thomas had been specifically chosen for palace duty because of his specialized knowledge and experience. The picture that emerged was of a highly trained professional who had recognized a threat that others might have missed and had acted decisively to prevent a tragedy. The Medal of Valor hadn't been awarded hastily or for political reasons. It had been given to someone who had genuinely earned it through skill, courage, and dedication. As the day's proceedings continued, more witnesses were called to testify. Maria, Thomas's sister, took the stand to describe the atmosphere at the palace following the incident. Her testimony painted a vivid picture of the fear and relief that had swept through the staff when they learned how close disaster had come. "Everyone knew something serious had happened," Maria said, her voice shaking slightly with remembered emotion. "But it wasn't until later that we understood the full scope of what Thomas had prevented. The entire royal family sent personal thank you letters to him. I've never seen the Queen show such personal gratitude to a staff member." The royal family's response was another piece of evidence that supported Thomas's version of events. Chun presented copies of the letters, with personal details redacted for security reasons, but with enough content visible to show the genuine appreciation and recognition of Thomas's actions. Perhaps the most compelling testimony came from Detective Inspector Sarah Williams, who had led the investigation into the terrorist plot. Williams had been reluctant to testify due to ongoing security concerns, but the importance of the case had convinced her superiors to allow her to speak. Mr. Mitchell's intervention was absolutely crucial, Williams testified. Not only did he prevent the immediate attack, but the arrest of the suspect led to intelligence that allowed us to break up the entire terrorist cell. We arrested 6 other individuals and prevented at least 3 additional planned attacks. Williams went on to explain that the gaps in the public record that Parker had identified were standard procedure for cases involving national security. The missing witness statements existed, but were classified. The timeline gaps were created by redacting information that could compromise ongoing investigations or reveal security protocols. Every detail Officer Parker has questioned has a legitimate explanation, Williams said firmly. The idea that this medal was awarded fraudulently is not only wrong, it's insulting to everyone who worked on this case. By the end of the second day, the mood in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. What had begun as a case about potential fraud had become a story of genuine heroism and sacrifice. Officer Parker, who had seemed so confident in his accusations, now appeared increasingly isolated and defensive. During a recess, Parker approached Thomas's lawyer with an unexpected proposal. He wanted to speak with Thomas directly, outside the formal court proceedings. Chen was initially reluctant, but Thomas agreed to the meeting. They met in a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom. Parker seemed different away from the formal setting, younger, less certain, and clearly struggling with the weight of what he had learned. "I need to ask you something," Parker said without preamble. "Did you know about the princess? I mean, when you acted, did you know she was the target?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "I knew she was scheduled to be in that area later. I knew the man was suspicious and had some kind of device. I put those facts together and acted. But did I know with absolute certainty what he was planning? No. I just knew I couldn't take the chance." Parker nodded slowly. "I've been a police officer for 6 years," he said. "I've seen people get away with things because of their connections or their status. When I saw your medal and the gaps in the record, I assumed. I thought I was exposing corruption. You were doing your job," Thomas replied without any trace of anger. "Questioning authority, demanding accountability, those are important things. I don't fault you for that. But I was wrong," Parker said quietly. "Not just about the facts, but about you. I made assumptions based on incomplete information, and I nearly destroyed the reputation of someone who deserved better." The conversation continued for nearly an hour. Parker asked questions about Thomas's military service, his years as a Royal Guard, and the weight of carrying such a significant secret for so long. Thomas answered honestly, finding unexpected relief in being able to share his experiences with someone who was genuinely trying to understand. When they returned to the courtroom for the final session, Parker did something that surprised everyone present. He stood and requested permission to address the court directly. "Your Honor," Parker began, his voice filled with emotion, "I want to formally withdraw my complaint against Mr. Mitchell. The evidence presented over the past 2 days has convinced me that I was wrong to question the legitimacy of his medal. More than that, I want to apologize to Mr. Mitchell and to this court for wasting everyone's time with unfounded accusations." Judge Foster looked surprised but nodded for Parker to continue. "I became a police officer because I believe in justice and accountability," Parker said. "But justice also means recognizing when you're wrong and making it right. Mr. Mitchell earned his medal through courage and sacrifice that I can barely comprehend. He deserves recognition, not persecution." The courtroom was silent as Parker returned to his seat. Thomas felt a complex mix of emotions: relief, vindication, but also a kind of sadness for the young officer who had been so determined to expose what he thought was corruption. Judge Foster took a few moments to review her notes before delivering her ruling. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had been genuinely moved by what she had heard. "This case has been unusual in many ways," she began. "What started as an accusation of fraud has revealed a story of genuine heroism that had been hidden for legitimate security reasons. Officer Parker's concerns about accountability and transparency are valid and important, but they were misapplied in this case." She looked directly at Thomas. "Mr. Mitchell, the evidence presented to this court demonstrates beyond any doubt that you earned your Medal of Valor through exceptional courage and skill. Not only will you retain the medal, but I want to personally commend you for your service to your country and your commitment to protecting others, even at personal cost. The judge's words brought Thomas a sense of closure he hadn't realized he needed. For 15 years, he had carried the weight of that day in relative silence, unable to share the full story of what had happened. Being able to finally tell the truth, to have it acknowledged and validated, felt like a tremendous burden had been lifted from his shoulders. A physical blow. For 15 years, he had carried the weight of that day with him, not as a burden, but as a reminder of what truly mattered. The medal wasn't just a piece of bronze and ribbon to him. It represented the most important moment of his life, the day when his actions had saved someone precious beyond measure. But now, as he stood before Judge Margaret Foster's courtroom, Thomas found himself in the impossible position of having to prove his heroism to a legal system that dealt in facts and evidence rather than honor and sacrifice. The medal felt heavier than usual against his chest, its familiar weight now carrying the added pressure of doubt and scrutiny. Judge Foster was known for her fairness, but also for her strict interpretation of the law. She had built her career on the principle that truth must be supported by verifiable evidence, and she had little patience for emotional appeals or unsubstantiated claims. When she looked at Thomas across the courtroom, he saw neither hostility nor sympathy, only the cold professionalism of someone determined to uncover the facts. The courtroom was surprisingly full for what many considered a minor dispute. Word had spread through the local community about the case, and people were curious about the decorated guard who was being accused of lying about his service. Some supported Thomas, remembering his years of dedicated service and his reputation for integrity. Others were drawn by the scandal, eager to see a figure of authority brought down. Officer Parker sat in the front row, his notebook open and his expression serious. He had prepared extensively for this moment, gathering what he believed was compelling evidence that Thomas's medal had been awarded based on false information. Parker saw himself as a crusader for truth, determined to expose what he viewed as corruption within the system. Thomas's lawyer, Robert Chun, was a veteran of military law who had taken the case pro bono after hearing about the situation. Chun believed strongly in his client's innocence, but he was also realistic about the challenges they faced. The burden of proof was on them to demonstrate that Thomas deserved the medal, and 15-year-old memories and incomplete records made that a difficult task. As the proceedings began, Judge Foster outlined the case clearly. Officer Parker had filed a petition claiming that Thomas Mitchell had fraudulently obtained the Medal of Valor and requesting that the court order its return. The judge would hear evidence from both sides and determine whether the medal had been properly awarded or should be stripped from Thomas. Parker's presentation was methodical and thorough. He displayed charts showing gaps in the official timeline, highlighted missing documentation, and pointed to what he called inconsistencies in various reports. His argument was that the palace had rushed to award the medal without proper investigation, possibly for political reasons or to avoid negative publicity. Your Honor, Parker concluded, the evidence clearly shows that the circumstances surrounding this medal are questionable at best. We cannot allow decorated officers to maintain honors they haven't truly earned, regardless of their position or connections. The words stung Thomas deeply, but he maintained his composure. He had faced worse challenges in his life, and he knew that the truth, however complicated, would eventually emerge. But as he listened to the accusations being laid out in legal language, he couldn't help but think back to that day 15 years ago, the day that had changed everything. It had been a routine morning at the palace. Thomas was assigned to the East Wing, monitoring the entrance used by staff and visitors. The area was usually quiet during the early hours, with only essential personnel moving through the corridors. But something had felt different that day, though Thomas couldn't have explained why at the time. The first sign of trouble had come when he noticed a man in maintenance clothing acting strangely near the service elevator. The man kept checking his watch and looking around nervously, behavior that immediately caught Thomas's attention. Years of security training had taught him to trust his instincts, and something about this situation felt wrong. When Thomas approached to check the man's credentials, everything happened quickly. The man produced what appeared to be a small device, and Thomas realized with sudden clarity that this was no maintenance worker. The device looked like a detonator, and The man's desperate expression left no doubt about his intentions. What happened next would be debated for years to come. But Thomas remembered every detail with crystal clarity. He had lunged forward, grabbing the man's wrist, and wrestling for control of the device. The struggle had been brief, but intense, ending when Thomas managed to disarm the intruder and subdue him until additional security arrived. The investigation that followed had revealed a sophisticated plot to plant explosive devices in the palace during a planned visit from foreign dignitaries. The man Thomas had stopped was part of a terrorist cell that had spent months planning the attack. By stopping him, Thomas had not only prevented a potential tragedy but had also provided crucial intelligence that led to the arrest of other conspirators. The Medal of Valor had been awarded to Thomas in a private ceremony 3 months later. The Queen herself had pinned it to his uniform, thanking him for his service and courage. For Thomas, the medal represented not personal glory but a reminder of how close the palace had come to disaster and how important their work truly was. Now, sitting in the courtroom and listening to Officer Parker's accusations, Thomas wondered how something so clear and meaningful had become so complicated and disputed. The gaps in the official record that Parker had identified were real, but Thomas knew they existed for reasons of security, not deception. Much of what had happened that day remained classified to protect ongoing investigations and security protocols. But explaining that to a court was proving more difficult than Thomas had anticipated. Judge Foster listened carefully to both sides, asking pointed questions and demanding specific evidence. When Thomas's lawyer tried to explain the security concerns that prevented full disclosure, the judge was unsympathetic. "Mr. Chun," she said firmly, "this court deals in facts and evidence, not vague claims about classified information. If your client cannot provide concrete proof of his actions, then Officer Parker's concerns appear to have merit." The first day of hearings ended with Thomas feeling more uncertain than he had in years. Walking down the courthouse steps, he caught sight of his reflection in a window and noticed how the medal looked against his uniform. For the first time since receiving it, the decoration felt like a weight rather than an honor. That evening, Thomas called his sister Maria, the only family member who knew the full story of what had happened 15 years ago. She had been working at the palace as a translator that day, and she had seen firsthand the chaos and fear that had gripped the staff when news of the incident spread. "You can't let them take it away," Maria told him over the phone. "You know what really happened, and so do the people who were there. This officer doesn't understand what he's asking for." But Thomas wasn't sure anymore. The legal process was forcing him to question everything he thought he knew about that day. Had his actions really been as heroic as they seemed at the time? Were the gaps in the record evidence of a cover-up, as Parker suggested, or simply the result of necessary security measures? As he prepared for the second day of hearings, Thomas made a decision that would surprise everyone involved in the case. Instead of continuing to fight the accusations defensively, he would tell his story completely and honestly, regardless of the consequences. The truth, he decided, was more important than the medal itself.